Hello there, folks, and welcome back. In this next section, we're going to take a look at some functionality that's going to allow us to build out the following feature. So if we check out the fan page, we've got all of the HTML elements we had before, and in addition, we've now got this comments section. So this is a part of the website where a user should be able to type in a comment like, I love Kid A, something like that. This is a reference to one of the albums up here. They should be able to click on the add comment button, and then it should add a comment to the page. So it should really add a P element to the bottom of the page once I've clicked on that button. So we're going to see some concepts now that are going to allow us to achieve this goal. So what are we going to look at? So then, let's take a look at our code at the moment. So we've got our index.html. We've got a new section down here with some HTML that describes the comments section of our page. And heading over to requirements.md, what I've written down here are some of the things that we need to add for the user. So we've written down here that the user needs to be able to input a comment on the page. Well, the user can do that already because they can just type into this box. Other thing that I've said as well is the following. When a user clicks on the add comment button, it should add the comment to the page in a paragraph. But this is very useful. I just want to summarize the feature or the functionality, I should say, that I want for the web page. When a user clicks on the add comment button, it should add the comment to the page in a paragraph. Cool. So we're going to head over to example.js and think about how we can do this. What I want to do is I want to kind of express in words the kind of thing that we are going to code. So I'm just going to write a small comment here to get you to think about this. So what we're really looking at is a situation where the user clicks on a button and then we need to do something afterwards. In other words, there is a user interaction with one of the elements in the page, and then we want to do something afterwards. And this something will be adding a comment to the page. So we're going to see how we can make this happen. First of all, it's important to look at the first concept here. Whenever we interact with a page, sometimes it may be clicking on something, sometimes it might be typing. Anytime we have a user interaction on the page, this is going to trigger an event in the browser. What do we mean by event? Well, we can head over to javascript.info. This is just one place where I can look at documentation. You can look for event. In fact, if we go back to javascript.info, browsers, and then in introduction to browser events, we have a definition here that I've seen before and that I think is quite useful. It says here on javascript.info that an event is a signal that something has happened. So an event in this context here, if I click on the add comment button, then the browser is going to create a click event. And this is a signal that the user has interacted with the page. Okay. So there are lots of different kinds of events. So we can have a click event, as we've just talked about. We might have an event where the user moves their mouse over a particular element. We might have a keyboard event where a user presses down one of the keys. Lots of different types of events like this, signaling that something has happened. So what we want to say here then, we could reformulate this a little bit more. We can say when a click event happens on the button, then we want to say do a console.log. So I'm going to break down this problem a little bit further and just say, let's suppose that there's a click on this button. Can we get a console log to appear in our console over here? Awesome. So then, in order to do this, in order to make this work, first of all, what we're going to need to do is we're going to need to access that button element. So if I head back to index.html, I can see here I have a form and I have a button element, line 31 here, where I have the add comment text. You can also see down here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to target that element. So use a query selector to get that. The document, dot query selector. And then the tag name, which is going to be button. Cool. And then what I'm going to also say as well is create a name for that. So we're going to say const button and assign that to be button like that. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to console log button and then see if we can see that in the browser over here. So saved that, not getting anything back here. Let's just refresh the page. So I had to refresh then, but when I refresh, I can see my button down here. Okay, that's the log that I had on line 11. Just to prove that, I can even add a string to this, just to make it absolutely clear that this is what we are dealing with. And indeed, you can see that string appearing here, and we're getting a log of that button object. Awesome. So once we've done that, now we want to say that when this click event occurs on the button, trigger a console log. So how can we do that? Well, what we're going to do is we're going to use a particular method that lives on the button element, and that's going to be called add event listener, like so. We go to the documentation over here, we might be able to check out add event listener here. Cool. And it says something like this: element that we're on, add event listener, and then the name of the event name, and then a handler, and then some other options which we don't need to worry about over here. So it says in the docs that event could be a string like click, and it says that here handler is a handler function. So let's go back over to our code. So we could put here click, and indeed this option comes up for me, auto completing in VS Code. And then the second thing here it says is going to be a handler. Would actually really think of the handler as being just a function. So I'm going to type in here function like so. So this is the key thing to take away from this syntax. We've got the button element that we're accessing using query selector. We're using a function called add event listener. We're using a click event, and then we have this function here. And the way this works is what it is saying is that whenever the user clicks on a button or on this specific button, the browser is going to call this function. Okay, so one more time, this is very important. Whenever the user goes onto the page and clicks on this button, the add comment button over here, it means that this function is going to get called. So let's try that. So let's just try doing string in here and see if we can get that to run. So heading down here to add comment, click on that, click on it again. We do see the log briefly appear, but at the moment, add comment, whenever I click on it, is triggering a refresh of the page. So this is not something we want, but this is the kind of the default behavior when we're using this button inside of the form element. So what we need to do is we need to turn off that behavior. We need to say, when we click on the button, stop refreshing the whole page. We don't want that to happen. So to do that, what we can do is we can go into function and we can add a parameter here called event. Event is a object that gets generated whenever this function gets triggered. So we don't need to worry about where the event comes from, that just comes to us whenever this function is triggered. And it's the browser that passes that event object to the function. So we don't need to worry about going into the event object too much just yet. What we need to understand at this stage is that we have a function called prevent default, which is a special function on the event object. And if we call this, we can say that prevent default will stop the browser from refreshing the page, I should say the page from refreshing every time when we click on the button. We'll click on the button. Okay, so that's what we're doing here when we use this special function. So now if I click on add comment and I click on it again, notice this time the browser isn't refreshing whenever I click, and you can see this number being incremented to reflect the fact that every time I click on the button now, we're seeing a console log appear in here. So in other words, on that button, we have now essentially registered a function, and we're saying the browser is now going to call this function every time we click. And because we've used event.prevent default here, the browser is also going to mean, we're also going to ensure that we're not refreshing the page every single time. Awesome. So we don't just want to log here every time we click on the button. We also want to do some more things in here. So we also want to say in here, now, going back to our requirements, what we want to do is we want to add a comment to the page. So here, I'm just going to summarize what the next steps are. We're going to say we need to create a new paragraph element. And add it to page. Awesome. Cool. So let's have a think about how we are going to do that.